Hello and welcome to the Module 2 lecture about what is critical thinking. So for this week's topic, we're going to just be talking about what is critical thinking, what are its defining features, what are the benefits of critical thinking, what skills and attitudes does one need to be a critical thinker. So there are a lot of different perspectives about this, and the text that I've chosen that I think articulates this really well is Asking the Right Questions by Brown and Keeley, the main text for our book. So notice the title there, Asking the Right Questions, right? The authors really assume, right, their argument is based on the fact that critical thinking is about learning, valuing, and really developing the ability to ask certain kinds of questions. The second reading for this module is an excerpt from Peter Berger, a very famous sociologist, an excerpt from a book that he originally published in 1959 called Invitation to Sociology. And the excerpt that I've assigned you goes by the same name. And so what I like about pairing chapter 1 of the Asking the Right Questions text with the Berger Invitation to Sociology is Berger's perspective on critical thinking about society from a sociological perspective is very similar to what Brown and Keeley are talking about in that first chapter, even though they use very different words. But I really want you to think about these readings in relationship to one another this week. So, as Brown and Keeley talk about, right, we live in a very noisy world. And the world we live in is one where we need to constantly make very well-informed decisions about everything from voting to where you go to school, where you choose to live, if you have any choice in where you can live, the cars that you buy, other purchasing decisions, anything of that nature, right? Whether to get in or get out of a relationship, the decision to have or not have a child, right? We need to make very well-informed decisions, and also in our professional lives. So no matter what profession you're ultimately pursuing, whether it's nursing or computer science, or you want to be a doctor or a lawyer, a social worker, we all have to make well-informed decisions. Now, the problem that often comes into play here is that we have to usually make these well-informed decisions in the context of information overload. We are constantly bombarded with various sources of information on the internet, in books that we read, if you read the news, watch the news, and also the other people in our lives that try to give us information and really convince us to try to adopt a particular view of something. And the world we live in, right, there are many people, both experts on topics and certainly non-experts, that are constantly trying to convince us to think about something in a very particular way or behave in a certain way. So this is the challenge that we really face, and one that necessitates developing our critical thinking skills. So what is critical thinking? So critical thinking in this course, how I'm going to define it for you and how we're going to learn about it for the next 15 weeks is that it's a very specific set of attitudes and skills, okay? And I really want to highlight 3 of each. So the skills that we need to be a critical thinker. So someone who's a critical thinker has a very acute awareness of critical questions, especially questions that help us evaluate arguments. Now think about what the word evaluation means, right? It means not just accepting that argument at face value, right? You have a friend, she's telling you, hey, you should date this person or break up with this person for these reasons, right? They're trying to make an argument to you and give you reasons for accepting their argument. But, right, you have to use your own knowledge, right, your own set of values, and as we'll talk about in this class, a set of critical questions that you'll develop to help you evaluate whether or not you're going to accept or challenge her argument. The second skill that's really important for a critical thinker to have is the ability to just identify when we come up against arguments, when people are making an argument to us, the values, especially values about right versus wrong, and how our values shape the arguments that people are going to make to you, and also the evidence that people are going to present to you for why you should accept their argument, right? So as myself as a sociologist, one of the primary things we do is we collect research, right? We go out and we collect evidence. We go out into the field. We go with a particular question that we want to answer, and we actually study the social world to try to bring evidence to bear on very important questions. Now, sometimes people will present you with evidence for why you should accept their argument, but sometimes they won't. So another important skill of a critical thinker is to be able to identify really important missing information, right? We want to focus on not only what an author is telling us, but what they're leaving out, what are they not telling us, and a critical thinker is able to identify that as well. The last skill is the ability to question our own things that we value. Do we value individual freedom? Do we value things like social justice, right? And it's not only about being able to identify our own values, but to question them and to really think critically about how they affect how we see this world, where we're constantly needing to make a lot of well-informed decisions. So once we develop these skills, it's also really important to see the world and use our critical thinking skills, but driven by a certain set of attitudes. So I want to go over 3 of these. Three really important attitudes that we should have as a critical thinker is that we should desire to both listen to and learn from others, right? We want to have a certain kind of humility, a recognition that we don't always have all the answers. And so we really want to recognize that other people have a lot of information. It's not always correct, right? And that's one of those ways we want to be able to evaluate others' arguments. But we really want to listen to other people, learn from other sources, and to be able to critically evaluate the information that they're giving us. We also want to develop the tendency to not accept what these other people say as fact without critical reflection. Think about a time when someone has told you something and you knew without a doubt that what that person was telling you was not true, okay? Sometimes it's not so easy for us to know without a doubt that what that person is saying is not true. So anything that someone tells us, right, in this world of information overload, we need to really critically reflect and have an attitude of being committed to critical reflection, not only about what others say, but about our own values. And last, we really want to develop an attitude of being committed to actively engaging with knowledge rather than just acquiring it. And Brown and Keeley have several really, I think, fun phrases for this distinction. Right, so they say actively engaging with knowledge. They call this the panning for gold approach. Right, if you can think of like an older movies maybe that you've seen where people have been panning for gold, and they dip the pan in the river where there's possibly gold, and they kind of shake it out, and there's rocks and other debris, and then little flecks of gold, right? And so what they're doing is they're trying to encourage you to think of sifting through all of this information in that way, recognizing that all the information that you're going to encounter in your daily life, not all of it is true, not all of it is valuable. Right? So we want to really actively engage with the knowledge and the information that we encounter on a daily basis, and not just acquire it, right? Don't just accept it as truth with a capital T, right? That's the sponge approach, right? If you've got water, say, on a counter and you set a sponge on it, right? That sponge just soaks up that water, right? We don't just want to soak up information without critically reflecting on it. So being able to have an attitude of always trying to strive for that panning for gold rather than the sponge approach is also very important for a critical thinker to develop. And so what that means is that critical thinkers tend to have a set of primary values, right? Things that we think are important and motivating tendencies that we really have in approaching our lives and our social worlds. That first one that Brown and Keeley talk about is autonomy, right? If you think about what the word autonomy is, right? Being able to act on our own, being able to make well-informed decisions on our own, acting as independent, critically thinking beings, and not necessarily always having to rely on others to tell us how to think and what to think. Critical thinkers also have as a primary value curiosity. They're very curious. Think back to when you were a young child, or think about the last time that you interacted with a young child. Did they ask you why about everything? Why this? Why that? What is this? What does this mean? And then you would answer their question only to have it be met with, well, why again? Well, this can be very annoying as a parent or as someone who's taking care of a child. But if you think about it, right, that little kids tend to have a really strong sense of curiosity. And as we get older, we tend to lose it. So becoming more of a critical thinker is about really becoming more like we were when we were 4 or 5 and asked why about everything. Now, as a critical thinker, we're not going to question everything, but we certainly want to question more. The third value is humility, or being humble, right? Recognizing that we don't have all the answers, that we may be wrong about certain things, and that developing critical thinking skills and learning to ask certain critical thinking questions, right, is really about saying, hey, I don't have all the answers, but I have this set of questions that's going to help me figure out the best answers to those questions. And finally, critical thinkers have a very deep respect for good reasoning. And by good reasoning, we're going to talk about that a lot this semester. Good reasoning means, right, being able to make an argument and offer reasons for why someone should accept our argument based on good, solid, sound evidence. Right? So like I talked about a moment ago, researchers, they go out and they collect evidence as a way to answer questions, right? They don't just come up with an answer for no good reason, but actually what is actually happening in the social world. So it's a very important part of respect for good reasoning. So these 4 primary values are hopefully values, many of which I'm sure you already have, but values that you'll continue to develop as you develop your critical thinking skills. Now, last for this module, what I'm going to have you do is read Peter Berger, a very small excerpt of his 1959 book, Invitation to Sociology. I absolutely love this book, and I highly recommend it, the whole thing, for anyone who's interested in critical thinking, especially critical thinking from a sociological perspective. And I recognize that you're not all sociology majors, but this is an amazing, amazing way to look at the world. And I love the title here, Invitation to Sociology. The title could also be Invitation to Critical Thinking. What Berger's doing here is he's inviting us to think in a particular way, to adopt a particular critically thoughtful view on the world. And so much of what Berger's talking about, again, using different words, is very similar to what Brown and Keeley are talking about in that first chapter. So he says that critical thinking from a sociological perspective means not taking others' explanations for granted, right? Just because someone tells us something doesn't mean it's true. And it might be true, but there might be a lot of different ways to look at the world. It also means developing our curiosity. There's curiosity again, right? An incredibly important primary value of a critical thinker, right? We want to develop our ability to ask certain questions and to always be primed to ask those questions when we're trying to evaluate someone else's arguments, or when we're even trying to evaluate our preconceived thoughts about the world. He says that critical thinking from a sociological perspective also entails understanding that the social world has different levels of meaning. I absolutely love this part of Berger's reading. Think about it. Think about, for example, you're starting a new semester in the last week here or so, right? Think about how maybe your professor understands a class, and how you as a student understand the class and understand the college classroom and the college context, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that as a professor my view on the class is wrong or that yours as a student is wrong. What it means is that we're differentially positioned, right? We occupy 2 different positions, you as student, me as professor, in that particular social context. So we're going to see things very differently, right? We come at the world from different viewpoints. And that's a good way of thinking about a lot of different contexts, whether it's in your family, in your interpersonal relationships, at your workplace. Right? We come at the world from different viewpoints. And that's a good way of thinking about a lot of different contexts, whether it's in your family, in your interpersonal relationships, at your workplace. If you work, think about the last time that maybe you had, a conversation with your boss or coworkers, and the two of you saw things from a very different perspective. The social world has very different levels of meaning, and one of the things that we're going to talk about throughout the semester is that critically thinking about society really involves thinking about how there are very individual level ways of understanding social issues, what we might call micro level ways of understanding issues, how the individual experiences something, but there are also larger social and structural ways of understanding an issue. So I study a lot about marriage trends. If we want to understand the interpersonal or the very individual, the very kind of private viewpoint of marriage, right, we might go and interview people about what their marriage is like and ask them to comment on, right, their own personal experience. I have a tendency to do that kind of research. However, a lot of other, people who study research on marriage look at quantitative research trends. What are the marriage rates? How many people are getting married every day or every year in the United States? How many of those marriages end in divorce? Both of those issues are ways of looking at the same topic of marriage, but they're very different levels of meaning, right? Very different ways of understanding an issue. Okay, so we're going to talk about that more, and critically thinking about society entails being able to think about social issues from both of those perspectives. Barker also argues that we have to look beyond commonly accepted explanations of human behaviors and trends. And he has several great phrases for our tendency to do this. He says it entails seeing through or looking behind. And again, Barker's description of what it means to think sociologically is very similar to what Brown and Keeley are talking about by developing those skills and attitudes that allow us to be critical thinkers, right? We don't just want to accept what people tell us, right? We don't just want to accept what politicians tell us or what, newspaper authors tell us. You don't even want to always just accept what your professors tell you, right? This is part of developing that value of autonomy, actually developing the ability to go out, ask questions, and find answers to those questions on your own. Okay, so Barker's talking about something very similar here. And he also says that critical thinking about society entails thinking in terms of what he calls sociology's debunking motif. I know it's kind of an awkward phrase. Now, when we typically use the word debunking, what we typically mean is, right, kind of proving that something is wrong or false, not the right way to look at an issue. But Barker doesn't necessarily mean that here. What he's talking about is what I just mentioned a moment ago, right? Being able to see through commonly accepted explanations of human behavior and trends. And my favorite example, because I study marriage and family a lot, is the one that he offers about falling in love. Okay, it's towards the end of the article, right? He says that when people think about why it is that we partner with or get in a relationship with someone else or why we marry someone else, if you ask most Americans, why is it that you got married, they'll say, oh, we fell in love. But another way to look at this, right, understanding different levels of meaning, did you know that research finds that people who get married tend to be very, very similar in terms of various social characteristics, including their class, so their economic class, their education level, their race or ethnicity, their religion, and their age. And so what's really interesting is, yes, people perceive that they get married because they fall in love, but what's really interesting is Cupid's arrow does not tend to be that haphazard, right? It's not just random, right? We tend to fall in love with people who are very much like us, socially, economically, religiously, racially, educationally. For example, Those of you, right, going to college, soon going to get your college degree, did you know it's very, very likely that you will end up partnering with or marrying with someone who also has a college degree? It will be much less likely for you to marry someone who doesn't, especially someone who doesn't have a high school diploma. So does that mean we don't marry because we fall in love? No, we do. Most of us think that we do, especially in a very romantic, love-based culture like the U.S. But it also means that what predicts who will have the ability to fall in love with, right? The people that we're actually around. Much of that is predicted by having similar social characteristics, right? So he's offering us this example, right, as a way of thinking sociologically, right? This is what it means to think critically about social issues, is understanding those different levels of meaning, different ways of understanding an issue, right? And being able to ask questions such as why? What's the evidence? So I really hope that you enjoy pairing the Berger reading with that first chapter of Brown and Keeley. And good luck on all the weekly assignments. Please let me know if you have any questions.